Hello, everyone, and welcome to another segment of Sage Advice. That is where I speak to Jeremy Crawford. Hello, Jeremy.
Hello there.
About all of the fun Dungeons & Dragons rules, focusing in on a subject that may have a lot of questions or have an interesting philosophy or design behind. And I'm very excited to speak to Jeremy in 2019. I feel like we didn't get a chance to talk a lot for this segment in 2018, and so we're gonna right that ship by diving into underwater combat for this topic.
Nicely done.
Yes.
Yeah, I was figuring we're going to be doing a lot of metaphors today about swimming, diving in, plunging deep.
These are all puns that will be made throughout this segment, I'm sure.
Yes, and in 2018, not only did you and I not get to talk a whole lot on the podcast, but also the Sage Advice column on our website was on hiatus for a while, really just because I got too busy. But people who follow Sage Advice will be glad to know that this very month we'll be releasing an updated version of the Sage Advice Compendium on our website that not only includes answers to some new rules questions, but also reflects some of the changes that we made recently in the errata to the core rulebook. So it brings the Sage Advice Compendium up to date because since the errata, there have been some slight bits of disjointedness between what the core books now say and what the Sage Advice Compendium used to say, and now all of that will be cleared up.
Okay, perfect, awesome. And you were busy for working on all of the crazy amount of products that we did for the second half of 2018, and that schedule continues apace in 2019. So we're really excited about all the stuff you're working on. But we might have a few hints in this topic. In fact, I know Kate and Nate spoiled that we're having a nautical themed product coming soon, and the most recent Unearthed Arcana also delved into a little bit of launched a few ships. You might say.
Yes, yes, indeed.
But today's topic on underwater combat, I don't think is something that we've kind of touched on a lot. Is that right?
We haven't. I think we might have touched on some topics before that relate to it loosely, but we haven't dove in. There it goes again.
We've gotten our feet wet, but now we're gonna immerse ourselves in Dungeons and Dragons.
Yes, we're gonna do some laps in the underwater combat pool.
All right, so start us off with the backstroke. How do we, where do we start with underwater combat?
So I want to start with, where do people find the rules for this? Because there are actually some rules for you both in the Player's Handbook and in the Dungeon Master's Guide. The Player's Handbook gives you the basics of fighting underwater, but there are actually some framing rules in the Dungeon Master's Guide that are important for before that fight even starts. So if people, if they hop into their Dungeon Master's Guides and they take a look at Chapter 5, which is called Adventure Environments, there's a section in that chapter called Unusual Environments that has an entire section on adventuring underwater. You'll know you're in the right place because there's a big painting of an adventurer swimming underwater as she finds a treasure chest and is opening it up. And this section gives you a table for underwater encounters, if you just want to roll up for what did we encounter while we were traveling under the sea.
Right.
But even more importantly, and this is the part that introduces underwater combat, there's a table in that section that gives suggested distances for starting an encounter underwater. We give on our Dungeon Master screen starting distances for fights in other environments. So here in the DMG, we give you distances for, hey, if you're underwater and a fight starts, here's some suggestions for how far away you are from your opponents when that fight starts. And this is taking things into account like visibility and whatnot.
Right.
We also, in that section of the Dungeon Master's Guide, give you some information on traveling by sea. We also give suggestions for visibility at sea, which you can also use for figuring out if you're above water and sailing around on the surface, how far away you might be from maybe an opposing pirate ship when you first spot it. So we've got all of that for you right there in the Dungeon Master's Guide, which I often think of as our treasure trove book that people are constantly rediscovering because we jam-packed so many different things in there.
I was going to say, when you started to go through when rules would be, I'm like, I bet it's in the Dungeon Master's Guide already. I bet there is tons there that you get questions on all the time. And I following you on Twitter, I know there's always ones like, yes, it's right here. This is the rule. No questions needed because it's already been answered in the Dungeon Master's Guide.
But again, I have a lot of patience about that, partly because we did jam so much into this book that it can sometimes be like wandering into this treasure compartment you discover hidden at the back of your house and like, oh my gosh, where did all this amazing stuff come from?
And now I feel so inspired after looking at it,
yeah,
type of thing. So I get that.
So there's a little bit more actually about underwater stuff. If you flip earlier in that chapter, there's a section called Wilderness Hazards where we also give you the rules for frigid water, and also slippery ice and thin ice, all things that also can pertain to aquatic adventuring, fighting underwater, especially that bit on frigid water. If your character is stuck in super duper cold water and you might be facing hypothermia.
And I assume levels of exhaustion would come very quickly.
Yes, yeah. So all of that is there for you in the DMG. But now let's say, okay, you've been swimming around and that shark is coming for you, or the Sahuagin, or the Kraken, or the many, many other things that you can face in the deeps in Dungeons and Dragons. Because that is one of the awesome things about D&D is we've got critters for you to meet in pretty much any environment, whether it's far up in the sky, deep under the sea, deep underground, in other planes of existence. And I think the creatures that you can meet underwater are often particularly horrifying because they can be so alien. They are often similar in some ways to the alien quality that we associate with aberrations. Thinking of mind flayers, beholders. When you look at Sahuagin, Kuatoa, the number of the monsters associated with them, and even creatures from our own world like sharks, where they have these unreadable, almost dead-looking eyes. There can be a horror associated with the deeps.
Even just the idea of like rows and rows of teeth that are like, it just seems like something an alien designer would come up with, like an H.R. Geiger or something like that, right? Like it doesn't seem like it's real on them because they're so such a prehistoric creature as far as their development and evolution over time. That it almost feels like you're looking into the past when you see a creature that is adapted for underwater combat in a way.
Yeah, absolutely. There are also, though, thankfully, creatures you can meet underwater who might be your friends, like the Merfolk. They could be, they could just as well be your foes if you piss them off. There are the Marrow, who probably more likely to be your enemies, but still, you might be able to befriend them and get them to help you out if you happen to be adventuring underwater. Now, and again, I keep delaying getting to the combat itself because
there's a lot more context there. Yeah.
Exactly, because just being underwater so often brings with it issues of breathing, your senses, these sorts of things. Typically, if characters are spending a lot of time deep underwater, they're doing so with the help of something like the water breathing spell or magic items that are giving them the ability to breathe underwater. Now, if you don't have magical assistance or you don't have the innate ability to breathe underwater, as some of the races in the game do and many of the creatures in the game do, well, then you can just rely on holding your breath.
Right.
And that's when you go to the suffocation rules in the player's handbook, which are in the chapter called Adventuring. And there, in a section called the Environment, right after the rules on falling, we've got the rules on suffocation. I'm not going to go into all the details there of suffocation. Just if anyone listening is unfamiliar with those rules, the main thing you want is a high constitution. The more constitution you have, the longer you're going to be able to hold your breath. And once you stop being able to hold your breath, watch out because you're going to start suffocating, and beware because then death is approaching rapidly.
What are the penalties for that?
Okay. So
having been myself, not having looked at this ahead of time, but is it HP damage or does it go into exhaustion?
So here's how it works. any creature can hold its breath for a number of minutes equal to 1 plus its Constitution modifier, minimum of 30 seconds. We'd let you know in the rules. When you run out of breath, or if you're choking, because you can also use these rules for like
being choked
if
out.
like someone grabs
Strangling
you and
you.
is strangling you, you can survive for a number of rounds equal to your Constitution modifier. And then at the start of your next turn, you drop to 0 hit points and you are dying, and you can't regain hit points or be stabilized until you can breathe again. So this is really dangerous because
not even healing magic would be able to help you then.
yeah. And so you really want to make sure you don't get to that point where you just instantly drop to 0. And that is drop to 0 no matter how many hit points you have. Like theoretically, you can imagine, I mean, this is not actually a thing, but you could have like 2,000 hit points. But if you reach this point, bam, 0 hit points.
Yes.
And you are now hurtling toward death.
Now, does that work for monsters or enemy combatants? That type of thing.
This works for everything in the game, unless it's a creature that is somehow immune to suffocating. And there are actually a number of creatures in the monster manual that don't have to breathe. That's something that's called out. Usually in the text near the stat block of the creature, there's sometimes a section, like some constructs have it.
Yeah.
There'll be a little section that says constructed nature, and it will say this creature doesn't have to breathe.
Undead nature.
Or sleep. Yep, many undead have this ability.
Yeah.
So, there you can have the creepy thing of, undead sailors just walking around on the bottom of the sea or inside a shipwreck that you've met, and they don't care about suffocating because those creatures just don't have to breathe.
But it's something that like a high hit point creature such as a Tarrasque or something like that, you might be able to, if you're taking away their air or somehow, it might be a very clever way for a party to not have to whittle away at something for 20 rounds, but do it very quickly instead. Yeah,
maybe a very clever group could somehow try to transport whatever giant creature they're up against to the bottom of the sea and hope they just
hope it doesn't get up in 4 rounds.
Right.
Yeah.
But it might have a high enough constitution that it could hold its breath long enough and get to the surface in time. But yeah, I'm sure someone listening has already tried this tactic with some ancient dragon or something else.
And dungeon masters are shaking their fists. Saying
That's right.
We gave away such a great thing. But it's good to know that it works not only just for PCs, but for all creatures in the game.
That's absolutely right. And in fact, any rule in the game that refers to just a creature, which is true for the suffocation rule, because it says when a creature runs out of breath.
Yeah.
That rule applies to every single creature in the game, unless, of course, a particular creature, again, has something built into its stats or its description that lets it ignore that rule.
The exception-based nature of D&D.
Absolutely. Yeah.
All right. So So say you're underwater, you have a magic item or something like that allows you to breathe underwater so you don't have to worry about suffocating. Do arrows work?
Well, before we get to that, we're going to keep delaying the start of the fight. There's also the question of movement.
Oh, yeah. And sight, I guess, is also another thing we should touch on before we get there.
So we touch on that sort of visibility a bit when it comes to encounter distance in the Dungeon Master's Guide.
Right.
Otherwise, sight works underwater like everywhere else, where really you're just concerned about, is it dim light, is it bright light? And then the rules tell you, again, in the player's handbook, in the section on adventuring, what happens in dim lit situations versus areas that are totally obscured versus areas that are bright. What are the effects on your vision and whatnot?
Are there qualifications in there as far as like depth of water? So like, I would assume once you go 100 feet down, you're going to always be in dim light unless you have some kind of other light source.
So we don't get that specific.
Right.
Partly because D&D adventure environments can, just like our rules, be so exceptional.
Yeah.
Because you might go, hundreds of feet below water, but you might be, near an underwater city where it's actually
bright enough.
It's bright enough.
Yeah.
If anyone has seen the recent Aquaman movie and there's a visit to Atlantis in the film, that place is super bright.
Right. So you leave that to the dungeon master to still kind of determine whether it's dim light or not.
Exactly.
Right.
Exactly. Just like we don't tie light levels to different altitudes or anything like that outside of an underwater environment.
Makes sense.
So for the typical creature moving around underwater, and this is important both in and outside of combat, if you don't have a swim speed of some kind, whether it's innate to you or you have it because of a magic item or a spell, every foot you move underwater costs you an extra foot. Or another way of saying that is you move at half speed. So most people are going to be slowed down swimming around. Mm-hmm. But again, many creatures in the game and people who have special abilities get a swim speed that lets them move sometimes even faster than they could move walking around on the ground. Mm-hmm. And that also, that difference between creatures with a swim speed and creatures without can lead fights underwater sometimes to being especially scary because most of the things you're going to fight underwater have swim speeds, meaning they're way faster than you.
They are adapted for that type of combat specifically.
Yeah, and so they're often... let's say you're like, all right, we've got to get away from these guys, and you're, dog paddling away.
Like this chase scene is real short because they're going to come up and we're dead.
Yeah, exactly. Here comes Jaws.
Yeah.
So that is a big consideration in underwater combat is how fast can you move.
Right.
And so if you're going to be doing a lot of underwater combat, it's good for you to search for something, whether, again, it's a spell, a magic item, or something else in the game that's going to help you move faster when you're underwater. Once you're actually fighting, there are a couple of different rules that you need to account for, and these are all right here in the underwater combat section of the Player's Handbook. Mm-hmm. The biggie, and it's funny, I'm going to go over the rules in reverse of how we presented them in the book, because it is actually funny, and this is on me. We presented the rule that applies to everybody, and it's really important, as the very last sentence of the underwater combat rules, and that is creatures and objects that are fully immersed have resistance to fire damage. This applies to everybody and everything underwater. You have resistance to fire damage. So, this is even true if you're not, let's say, under the sea or at the bottom of a lake. Imagine you're in a fight with an enemy wizard in a dungeon and you're in a room where there might be a great pool of water. If you're worried that guy is going to cast fireball on the party, maybe on your turn you might want to hold your breath and dunk yourself fully into that pool, because just by doing that you just gave yourself resistance to fire damage. So that's a nice bit of sort of tactical optimization that I think people often don't account for. Or let's say you're going up against a red dragon. Try to face that red dragon somewhere where there's a body of water where you, when it's not your turn, you're underwater. Now, granted, the dragon will probably come crashing down into that lake and start clawing you and biting you to death. But at least you might mitigate the damage you're taking from its terrifying breath weapon.
Absolutely. Yeah, that makes sense.
Now, I also bring this up first because one of the questions I've often gotten over the last 4 years is, does a spell like Fireball work underwater?
Yeah. The
answer is yes. Our rule about fire damage here, that's how we account for fire underwater, that you have resistance to it. And, people often wonder, well, why does a fireball work underwater? Well, first off, fire with enough power and explosive force in our own world can occur underwater. It doesn't last.
Right.
But the heat can still be very harmful. But ultimately for us, we don't have to worry too much about physics because we can just, nod our hat toward...
It's magic.
It's magic.
Yeah.
And magic in D&D does all sorts of things that would be impossible for how we understand physics in our world.
Right, but our magic system doesn't necessarily say that just being immersed in water doesn't mean fire spells can't exist.
Exactly. What we just say is you have resistance to fire damage.
Right.
What this also means, and one of the reasons why we have this approach, is we don't want our DMs and players to need to have degrees in physics to adjudicate how magic works in our game.
Yeah.
You can simply run spells as they are written in every environment in the game, and we'll let you know in the rules if there's some kind of modification in a particular environment for how a spell works. And we do exactly that in our underwater combat rules by telling you people have resistance to fire damage when they're fully underwater.
Now, does that, I mean, I'm just going to run through a few common things you probably have answered many times in the past, but fireball makes sense to me because there's a point of light that that goes out and then it explodes, right? And that's similar to like a torpedo or something like that, so that can make sense to me. But something like, what is the cleric spell that's the divine
Flame Strike?
Flame Strike.
Uh-huh.
That comes from the heavens. When you're 300 feet underwater.
Oh, it's going to be spectacular.
Does it still come from the heavens?
We could imagine that thing whooshing down through the depths and imagine how that will look, seeing that light glittering through the water. So, yeah, watch
Still
out,
works.
buddy.
Still works.
Yep.
What about like a meteor storm or something like that? One of those spells that also
So
the layer of water that could potentially act as a buffer, we don't account for.
So some of our spells, especially high-level spells, do specify that they come from someplace in the sky. So you do have to account for that if the spell talks about that.
Oh, okay.
So if a spell says, hey, this is up in the sky, and then it comes down a certain range, you still have to account for that. It's still, when we use English words in our rules, unless we tell you they mean something different, they still mean what they mean. So if a spell says it comes from the sky, that means the sky. And as opposed to, just in a shallower portion of the ocean or whatever underwater environment that you're in. But as long as you follow what the spell says, sure, conjure up that wall of fire underwater. And as long as the spell doesn't say it must be supplied by, a steady stream of oxygen out in open air, it works underwater because what's supplying the fuel is the magic. It's not wood you're feeding to it or coal or oxygen. It's magic itself.
And you can, as a dungeon master, say like, oh, it's burning magically, and then it's creating steam, which can also, and you can make it look like it would underground, but having the idea that it is a magical effect that is feeding it.
Right. And here's the thing. DMs can decide how far they want to go with physical after effects when it comes to spells. If a DM doesn't want to be bothered with how fire affects water in the real world and whatnot, DMs, don't worry about it. Just do what the spell says. But, hey, if you're a DM where you actually are familiar with how different elements affect other environments in our real world, and you want to spice up your descriptions in D&D with that knowledge, also go for it.
Yeah.
This so often goes back to our principle in D&D of follow your bliss at your table. And please don't oppress yourself thinking you need to take something on that you're not equipped for.
Or that there is one right way to even, Jeremy Crawford's opinion about these rules is very much Jeremy Crawford's opinion about these rules.
Right, exactly. Ultimately, the final arbiter at any D&D table is the DM, and hopefully every DM is making choices that are the most fun for the particular table the DM is DMing for that day.
Got it.
And so if you have a group that just glories in, the steam effects of fire on X amount of water, dive right in. But don't get scalded by all that boiling water.
Well, all right. So I'm still going to pester you with more questions about specific things. So we mentioned casting spells. You can do that underwater.
Yep.
I'm assuming that means that any kind of somatic components are just as effective underwater as they would be above water. That
you anticipated, as you so often do on our show. One of the next things I was going to bring up, which is not actually addressed directly in the underwater combat rules, but I get asked often when it comes to spell casting, is can people cast a spell underwater that has a verbal component? Because people are worried, does the water muffling my voice so that it's impossible for me to articulate the spell? Here's the thing. What we tell you in the rules on verbal components is that you are creating a certain set of sounds that are crucial for the magic to take effect. similar to, if it's a somatic component, you're making certain gestures. And then if it's a material component, you're providing material that the spell uses. When it comes to those verbal components, they do work underwater. Nowhere in the rules do we tell you they don't. And one thing that people don't realize is that sound absolutely carries underwater. I mean, this is why things like sonar work, and why you can hear whale song very far away.
It's why I can understand what my friend says when we both go underwater and yell at each other.
Yes. Yeah.
It might be distorted, but that distortion doesn't affect the casting of a spell.
Exactly, because the spell's magic doesn't rely on other people's ability to hear those sounds. The spell's magic relies on you producing those sounds. Now, one thing I've talked about on Twitter is that if a person is talking underwater, they're not holding their breath. And this is something the rules don't really get into, but it's the kind of thing that a DM might want to keep an eye on is, if a person's concentrating on holding their breath because they can't breathe underwater, but now they suddenly are talking into the water, well, they're not holding their breath anymore. And so you might now, in the suffocation rules, tick over to, whoops, you've ran out of your held breath, and so now we're ticking down toward dying.
Right. And there's no specific guidelines in that, but you could reduce it by a few rounds. Say they have a high constitution modifier, say 4. If you cast a spell, that's reduced to 2.
Sure.
That type of thing.
You could do that, or just say, whoop, you stopped holding your breath.
It's done.
And now that death timer is started.
That sounds like something you would do, Jeremy.
It's funny. I am actually a pretty lenient DM.
Yeah.
My style as DM too would be usually to telegraph that people were going to be spending a bunch of time underwater so that they would at least have the chance to prepare for it. Because, if the wizard, for instance, casts water breathing, well, then it's not a problem. Because the wizard is able to breathe just fine underwater, and talking to do a verbal component will have, no effect on them when it comes to surviving.
Right.
Now I would, though, have the death clock start if a group receiving those warnings, like, hey, you guys are going to go down to this crashed ship 100 feet underwater, and you might be there for a while. And if the group stubbornly refuses to prepare in any way, that is when I enjoy, as a DM, exploring consequence.
Every action has a consequence.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
Whereas if, let's say there's a surprise situation and there was no way for the group to prepare for a dangerous suffocation situation, I tend to either be lenient or provide some way in that environment itself for them to save themselves.
Right.
Like, it could be there's a giant clam in the area that's emitting big bubbles of water.
Oh, man, that's a World of Warcraft reference
yes,
there. If I've ever seen
got
one.
it. You got it, man. Yes. That they could go stand in and breathe for
a little bit. Get that breathing timer back up.
Yes. Well done.
Yeah,
you caught that.
I knew exactly. I was like,
Yes.
oh yeah, the clamshell that for some reason has air that comes out of it, which I never really quite understood. But,
yes. Yep.
Because clams are known for having oxygen stored in them that they, dispel out or expel out.
It's magic, man.
It's magic. Don't worry about it. So yeah, that totally makes sense. That's when you would punish them. But then going back to spellcasting for a second, we talked about the verbal component. The somatic component. If you're moving at half speed, would your arms move at half speed if you're trying to move underwater?
Our movement rules don't get that specific. We don't make any kind of specifications about how quickly you move your arms or your fingers. And so we assume you can still make the somatic components, particularly because we're usually imagining that it's you twiddling your fingers, and you might be doing it a little more slowly, but not so much that it would inhibit your spell casting.
Okay, good. That's important to note.
Now, we are generous about a lot of this because we want you to go adventuring in cool environments. So it would, in a way, be counterproductive for us to make the rules super duper punishing to people to go underwater, because then basically for a lot of groups, they would just be like, oh, we're not going to go down there.
Yeah, I mean, especially if you're a spellcasting heavy group, it's like, well, we would never do that because we can't use half of the things that make our fantasy feel fun.
Right.
So why bother? Right.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Now, with weapon attacks,
Yes.
it does get trickier.
Okay.
And so let's go back to the underwater combat rules in the player's handbook. There, because you asked earlier, can I fire an arrow underwater? We address that. So if you make a ranged weapon attack underwater, it automatically misses beyond the weapon's normal range.
Oh, okay.
So anyone who doesn't remember, or maybe you normally play spellcasters and you don't know how weapons work, our ranged weapons in the game have two ranges. There's their first range, which is called their normal range, and then they have a second number, which is their long range. And a lot of monster stat blocks have these two ranges as well for their ranged weapon attacks. Anything beyond that long range, you just simply can't hit. It's out of range for that weapon. But anything between the normal range and the long range, you can fire at it, but you have disadvantage on your attack roll. And then anything within the normal range, the first number, you just make an attack roll as normal.
Yeah.
So what the underwater combat rules are telling us is underwater basically lops off your weapon's long range. Your weapon just has its normal range.
Right. And you automatically miss if you try to go after that.
Exactly.
Right.
Because the water basically is going to slow down. You know, when you fire off your longbow, that arrow just is not going to get as far as it would in the air. Now it gets a little rougher too for ranged weapon attacks. Even against a target within normal range, you have disadvantage on the roll. So suddenly it's like that rule that normally applies to long range
is now applying to
normal range. But there is a way around this, that disadvantage for normal range. And that is if you use a crossbow. And I would, by the way, apply this to really any ranged weapon that relies on some kind of mechanism to provide the force. So, for instance, if people were using our firearms rules from the Dungeon Master's Guide, I would also apply this to the firearms. You also...
because it's a magical effect, so it's a magical firearm, right?
Sure.
That's the black powder. We've kind of said that it's...
well, actually, we have firearms in the DMG that are just firearms.
Oh, okay. It's not the Forgotten Realms.
Yeah. And we also in the DMG, we have laser guns. So we have a variety of firearms.
Those definitely work underwater.
Yes.
Okay, so anything that has a mechanism that allows the projectile to go forward.
But this is an example of me saying, hey, DMs, I recommend that you apply this rule more broadly. Because in the PH, it just says crossbow. But really the intent here is something with a mechanism that's firing, as opposed to relying on your own strength, like with a longbow or a short bow.
Okay.
Nets are also accepted from this, although nets have other issues because you almost always have disadvantage when you're using a net anyway. Or a weapon that is thrown like a javelin, so a spear, a trident, or a dart. Those also are accepted from this. Now let's talk about melee weapon attacks.
Can I go back one more time?
Yeah.
Because is there any damage reduction associated with it at all?
There isn't. So for ranged weapon attacks, the only thing that's being affected is your range and your accuracy. But if you actually manage to hit, it's still going to do as much damage as it would normally.
Okay.
It's just harder to hit.
Even though the thought that like a fletching of an arrow might actually slow down enough so that, yes, you hit the target, but it just wasn't strong enough to hit it.
I know. But we just abstract that away by... So And in D&D, actually, this abstraction is all over the place when it comes to the combat rules, because the combat rules, and this goes all the way back, to 1st edition, they assume you actually are hitting way more than the dice say you are, but that your other hits, the ones we basically don't talk about in the narrative of the game, are not strong enough or telling enough to do significant damage that is worth talking about in the game, or that is relevant to the system.
So you're assuming even if you hit at a disadvantage under normal range, You just happen to hit at a joint of the armor rather than enough force to puncture through that armor.
Exactly. So D&D most of the time is basically, it's like a story that is mostly just zeroing in on those story beats that matter. You can, just like we don't dwell too much in D&D about people going to the bathroom, we don't.
Is that in the DMG?
Our combat rules don't dwell on like glancing blows, that kind of thing.
Because experienced dungeon masters can describe a miss as, oh, you hit the armor and it just glances off anyway. But it's not necessarily like everything shoots all over their heads or something like that.
But the idea in D&D, unless something has resistance or some other rule intervenes and messes with the damage in some way, that if you've managed to hit, it's a telling blow. It is a blow that is worth spending a moment on in the game and dealing damage and whatnot.
Got it. Okay, that makes sense. So you're going to say about weapon attacks then?
Melee weapon attacks.
Right.
So if you make a melee weapon attack underwater and you don't have a swimming speed, here's another place where swimming speed makes a difference. You have disadvantage on the attack roll unless you're using a dagger, a javelin, a short sword, a spear, or a trident. These are all basically thrusting weapons. Now, you can ignore all of this if you have a swimming speed. And it's worded this way so that fish and other creatures that have swimming speeds don't all have disadvantage underwater.
Got it.
This means that as the instant you have a swimming speed, which basically represents you moving with a kind of fluidity underwater, you don't have to worry about this rule. But if, again, you're underwater and you don't have a swimming speed and you're trying to make melee attacks, you're going to have disadvantage on your attack rolls unless you're using one of the thrusting weapons listed in the player's handbook.
Okay.
Because think about it, like if you're trying to swing around in an arc a slashing weapon, the water's going to slow you down. Now, someone could reasonably ask, why does having a swimming speed affect how well you swing that sword? Again, we're just abstracting away that the swimming speed represents not only your ability to move X number of feet underwater, but also represents a fluency with being underwater.
Yeah,
because
it's an adaptation and like a confidence and a feeling at home under the water that is abstracted and made sense here.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah, I get that.
And honestly, the specificity of listing out these weapons is an odd bit of detail for the 5th edition rules. We don't do this kind of thing elsewhere. It is funny. I've often thought of our underwater combat rules as it's almost like a ghost hanging out from a previous edition, because previous editions of D&D tended to have this kind of specificity.
Right.
It's quite likely that if I were designing these rules today, I would make them a little simpler, because I'm personally, and it's, again, I can only have myself to blame for this. I'm not a big fan of this specific listing out of things because it forces people to remember it.
Yeah.
And especially for a rule that you almost never use, it's kind of like, oh God,
when you were saying that, I was almost like, isn't that just every piercing weapon?
It could have been. That would be one way for us to do it.
A short sword, things like anything like that would fall under the spirit of what that rule is doing by listing that out.
Yeah, and there are a variety of ways that we could approach this that would be easier for people to use and remember.
Yeah, and then if you were using that, you can almost say that if you can use an arrow or anything that you would, obviously piercing is in the arrow thing, but any kind of. It's the motion. It's the intent behind the rule that could get out there.
And the thing is, there was already a nod in the rules to DMs approaching a rule like this with flexibility, because when you go to our improvised weapon rule, we already tell you, hey, DMs, if you want, you can consider all sorts of things to essentially count as another thing. We tell you, hey, DM, if a person tears off a chair leg and whacks somebody with it, if you want, you can treat it like a club. Or, if maybe someone takes an iron poker out of the fireplace and strikes somebody with it, you might treat it like a short sword or a dagger. we already say, hey, DMs, basically
already.
make rules calls on the fly that feel natural for the narrative, that interface well with the player character's abilities. So I would say people don't be afraid to take these underwater combat rules and extrapolate from them.
Okay.
And simplify them as you like.
Can I ask a extrapolating question?
Sure.
So, unarmed combat in underwater.
Uh-huh.
How does the monk's abilities interact with that? Because I'm not sure how I would adjudicate it based on that.
So unarmed strikes count as melee weapon attacks, and so your unarmed attacks would fall under this rule that unless you have a swimming speed, your attack rolls have disadvantage.
Okay.
So, hey, monk, get a swimming speed or a spell, that gives it to you, and you'll be fine.
But otherwise, you're at disadvantage with every flurry of blows
as you try
do.
to slowly punch underwater.
I love that visual of just like, oh, I can't get the force, maybe, and it's much. Doing it with disadvantage is perfect because it just means you're just going to hit less.
Yes, exactly. This is another way, too, for us to make underwater combat scary in a neat way because, again, if you're up against a bunch of creatures that have swimming speeds, they're going to be way more accurate than you are if you don't have a swimming speed. Or again, unless you're using one of these weapons that gets around this problem.
Right.
And so that's another thing that people can do, including a monk, is if they're going to go underwater and there's no way for them to get a swimming speed, at least equip themselves with these weapons.
Get yourself a trident. It's
Absolutely.
the only way you're going to be able to get through anything.
Yep.
If Aquaman has taught us anything, that's what.
Yes.
As well as how to lift, apparently. All right.
He is kind of built.
He is. I haven't seen the movie yet, but all of the posters and the trailers, I'm always like, oh man, he just gets bigger and bigger every
He's going to explode.
I swear those are just balloons. They're not.
Right. I have seen the movie, by the way, and it is big fun.
It is?
Yes.
Good.
The way I've described it to people, it is very dumb but very fun.
I think that's been the common review has been like, don't expect a thinking person's action film, but go in and enjoy it.
Yeah, and for D&D fans and anyone who's a fan of just all the nerdy things we love, there are so many fun bits. I mean, I can tell you this and it doesn't really spoil much, but like, you're going to see dinosaurs in this movie. You're going to see a kaiju in this movie.
What?
You're going to see creatures that are basically straight out of The Shadow over Innsmouth from Lovecraft's work.
Oh wow, all right, interesting.
And they even, it's early in the movie, they even actually tip you off that there's going to be something Lovecraftian in the film because there's an early shot in the movie, and if you look in the foreground, there's a copy of The Dunwich Horror by H.P. Lovecraft right there.
That's cool.
Yeah, and so and they travel to a bunch of different underwater cities. There are crab people. There are like mer people.
I'm sure there are people who watched that movie and then wanted to run a D&D combat underwater. And so this topic is perfect, and it's very topical.
And the thing I love about that movie, if anyone is thinking about running even either one adventure or an entire campaign underwater, is that movie shows what a rich adventuring environment the ocean can be.
Right.
Because the movie shows all of these different environments and cultures and monsters. So I think, hey, if you're thinking of doing an undersea campaign, check out Aquaman for some fun ideas.
Nice. And then, of course, check out all of these sections of the rules that we've been outlining, as well as, upcoming things.
Yes. And not only the Player's Handbook and the DMG, but also check out the Monster Manual, because we have not only monsters like, the Kraken and the Sahuagin and others that I've mentioned in this show. But if you go to the back of the Monster Manual, we also have the stats for a number of aquatic animals, sharks, etc. And we've introduced other aquatic creatures in our later monster books as well, both Volo's Guide to Monsters and Mordenkainen's Tome of Foes.
Are there any rules in there for Baby shark. Dun, 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 dun.
Not specifically.
Darn it!
Yes.
All right, good. I'm hoping I at least got shaking of fists from all the parents out there when I just did that. Any other kind of underwater combat topics do you think come up before we close this out?
Those I touched on all the biggies because the ones that come up most often are verbal components, operation of fire. I would also say, by the way, actually, there is another topic having to do with spells, because another thing that often comes up are spells that deal lightning damage, because people often want the electricity to start conducting through the water.
It's old Final Fantasy fans are like, if I have electricity, it does double damage.
Right.
Yeah.
Or anyone who's played, like Divinity Original Sin, where you can
get them in a puddle. And
Yep. So the D&D rules do not have any special rules for using lightning damage underwater. This is another area where DMs just sort of follow your bliss. If you just want to run the spells as written and not have them affected in any way by being underwater, other than, again, this one rule about resistance to fire damage, just run the spell as written and don't worry about it. That lightning bolt spell can just work the same way underwater it works everywhere else. If you and your group, again, like this idea of sort of deep environmental effects, then you can explore things like electricity, conducting more, etc.
And the problem with that, though, is it opens up so many more questions and problems, because you're like, all right, well, if physics-wise, I'm no expert, but I'm pretty sure if you cast something that has a lightning bolt underwater, everyone will be affected by the electricity damage in that case, not just one target.
And that can of worms is why the rules just ignore it. And again, philosophically, is why our magic in general ignores physics, because we don't want you to have to change how spells work environment after environment after environment, because it's not just underwater where this could suddenly be the case. I mean, if we wanted to get really fussy, we could suddenly start dealing with things like how much particulate matter is in the air in this particular place. And when you cast fireball, does it ignite,
Right. Or if it's an oxygen-rich environment, does it do more damage? And you're like, oh, gosh, you can't. Yeah. It's too much.
Unless, again, it's for a particular group, it's not. Because, hell, if you're a physicist or you're a physics buff and your group loves this kind of detail, I mean it. Follow your bliss. Yeah. Enjoy it. But everyone else, don't feel like you need to, because the rules are written with just this notion that magic is truly wondrous and supernatural, that it functions in ways beyond how nature works, at least how we understand it to work. I mean, that is part of what makes it magical.
Yeah, exactly.
Magic isn't meant to simply be a way to just sort of replicate what we can do with technology. Like even a spell like Fireball, people will often think of it as like an explosion, like a grenade or something. But you don't have to imagine it that way. Yeah. It really could you could imagine it as, and in fact, over the years, I've sometimes even described it thus, as a momentary tear in existence, and a bit of the plane of fire is basically, rushing into the area. And it might have absolutely nothing to do with how fire normally works, and how fire normally works with an environment, that it is purely this billowing out of magical energy that sort of has taken the form of fire,
right?
But doesn't necessarily behave the way fire works in our world.
Makes sense. So one final question, since I just happened to glance over to chat and I saw it. Casting fly while you're underwater gives you a flying speed, but that does not give you a swim speed, I'm assuming. So
that is correct. A flying speed is separate from a swimming speed. You need that flying speed for the air. It's not going to help you swim around.
Yeah, and so it doesn't. Your movement, you can't just fly through the 3 dimensions of the underwater.
Well, here is
the
thing I would say, and in fact, I think we've actually talked about this before on this very show. Imagine, though, a creature that doesn't have a walking speed or a swimming speed, but does have a flying speed.
Yeah.
In that case, you can use that speed to move around underwater, but it will be halved as normal.
Okay.
Because, again, the rule is essentially, if you use any speed other than a swimming speed underwater, every foot you move costs an extra foot. So I'll actually flip it around. From that standpoint, yes, you can use a flying speed underwater.
Oh, okay.
But it's going to be halved.
It's going to be half speed.
Yeah.
All right. And which kind of makes sense because, at least it might be advantageous for some players because sometimes flying speeds are higher than a swim speed might be, depending on what spell you've got prepared and whatnot.
Yeah.
What about climbing underwater cliffs? Still halved?
So the climbing rule is when you climb something, each foot you move costs an extra foot. But at that point, then you just have to decide, am I climbing up it or am I going to swim up? And it's going to be the same speed. I think it would be more fun to just swim up beside the cliff.
Well, that's you. I like climbing underwater. That's part of my thing.
Yeah.
My underwater cliff climbing that I've been doing.
Yeah.
Okay, cool. Well, I'm sure there's a couple other exceptions and corner cases that we weren't able to cover here, but I think that was a really good overview for anyone who is inspired by the last month's Unearthed Arcana or Aquaman or any other piece of content that shows off underwater combat and how you can do it in D&D.
Yeah, which may or may not be relevant for an upcoming book.
May or may not be. Let's. I think it's may not at this point. That's silly. How can people, if they have more questions now, how can they get in touch with you?
The best way is to reach out to me on Twitter, where I am Jeremy E. Crawford, and the E stands for Eric.
Excellent. That's what I thought the E stood for. But no, Eric is good. Thank you so much. I'm glad to be able to talk to you again about these rules, and we'll be doing more of that in 2019.
Outstanding. Always great to be here.
Thanks. All right. We have completed this Sage Advice segment, and it was only 53 minutes.
Close.
Yeah?
52.
52.
That's pretty good for us.
That's not bad. It's not bad. I was literally being like, I bet we could get to some Q&A stuff here in the last 20 minutes. No, of course not. We went right through.
No.
But one thing I might ask you to do, we normally do a outro, Shelly and I, as we're hosting this out. Would you want to be here as we do our outro? And
if you'd like me to, sure.
Say goodbye to the podcast? Why not? I keep getting a little bubble in my throat. Does that make sense for you, Ryan?
Yep.
Since I'm not sure we're going to be able to get Satine back in here, so we'll make this happen. Thank you, everyone in chat who's been here and playing around. We love you. This has been our first fun beginning of 2019 live recording, so thank you for all that. And now we're going to do the outro for the podcast episode, which generally we try to just say like, oh, wasn't that a great interview? Of course, I will be doing that, and you'll be saying what a great Sage Advice segment that was, but we'll make it work. Why not? And we'll just do general like D&D, like, oh, here's how you follow this and that type of thing. That was a fantastic interview with Max Gonzalez and Itme JP. Thank you guys so much for being around for that. I am obviously missing my co-host. Shelly Mazanoble will be hopefully back for episodes in the future, but wanted to kind of kick this off and get going. And then, of course, we have Jeremy Crawford still here on the microphone. So thank you for returning to record our Sage Advice segment for this podcast.
My pleasure, and I hope we have many more this year.
Exactly. Do you have any hint? I mean, obviously, we've been hinting all along about what's to come for Dungeons and Dragons, but you are going to be at PAX South very soon.
Yes. Next week, I will be at PAX South to DM the Acquisitions Incorporated Group's second session in Ravnica. And when we last left them, wood chippers were rushing in toward Jim Dark Magic and the dryad that they were there to rescue. So we'll see if they make it out of the wood chippers.
Now, your first foray dungeon mastering for Acquisitions Incorporated was during PAX Unplugged.
Yes.
At the end of last year. And you knew that you were going to be coming to PAX South. That must have been kind of fun to have that, being able to have a one coming very soon so that you could tie them together this way.
Yeah, and the last one was so fun to DM. Even as we were wrapping up, I was sitting there on stage making some notes, and I thought, I can't wait for the next session.
Nice.
And because it felt like a great home game. And, any DM, you've had that feeling before where, you just spent 3 to 4 hours DMing, but you're already dreaming about the next 3 to 4 hours.
I get that a lot, yeah. And it's just like a normal home game, but with 300 people live watching and laughing at your every move. Was that a somewhat new experience for you? I know you've Dungeon Mastered for years and years and years, but not in front of so many people.
Yeah, I've DM'd for people watching many times before, but yeah, never a group that big. And also now, of course, that the size of the audience is multiplying as the videos on YouTube and on Twitch. And it's been fun seeing, people's feedback. Of course, some people loved what I did. Some people will forever hate me for not being Chris Perkins. And
everyone hates me for not being. Everyone hates not being Chris Perkins.
But I just keep doing my best and keep having a great time DMing for those folks.
Well, I've heard nothing but good things about the storytellings you were able to weave together, and I'm looking forward to PAX South. So that's January 18th, 19th, and 20th, and I think when is your session? And on the 18th?
It's on that Saturday.
The Saturday.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so I think that's the 19th. Tune into that. That'll be on the Penny Arcade Twitch channel, and we will be hosting it as much as we can. So look for it here on the Twitch channel for D&D, twitch.tv/DND, and we'll be back up to a full schedule of many of our weekly shows as well as our internal interview shows. So Dragon Plus, which you are a frequent guest of on Bart's show, so you'll be on there. Mike Merles will be doing a bit of a hiatus on Mike Merle's Happy Fun Hour, but that should be coming back in March. And then we got Rivals of Waterdeep, as well as some more fun shows that I'm just itching to announce right now, but we're working on the final steps of that before we make that happen. But more and more will be added into January and February to a already robust schedule. So look for that. Of course, I do D&D news on Tuesdays leading into Dice Camera Action, where people can watch Chris Perkins still torture folks. So that is going strong, and they're on episode 123, I think, for next week. So I hope you can tune into that and see everything that's happening there. Dice Camera Action folks will be live at PAX South as well, without Chris Perkins being there. He is sending letters, I believe, that they will react to live on stage, opening up them and seeing them for the first time in front of everyone. And so I know he's been spending a lot of time making that feel as interesting and new. And DMing by proxy is pretty interesting. So I can't wait to see where that goes as well. And there's a bunch of other fun panels and things and new projects you might hear about at PAX South going on.
Quite possible.
Any other fun product stuff I'm forgetting to mention? I know our partners are doing all kinds of fun miniatures. There's a Falling Star ship that's coming from WizKids, which I'm really excited about. I love the idea of having a 2 scale, a 2 D&D miniature scale ship out there. I don't know why that would be worthwhile.
Who knows? And it's this time of year is always fun because it's the most mysterious because we haven't announced what's coming up this year, and so it's basically mum's the word on everything.
Right, exactly. Until Nathan Stewart spoils it all, which we love. So if you want to find out about anything happening in Dungeons and Dragons world, the best thing would be the twitch.tv/DND to watch more. Follow us on Twitter at wizards_DND. We are also on Instagram in that configuration. I myself am on Twitter and Instagram as Greg Tito. We're on Instagram as Greg_Tito, I believe. So look for me there. And, of course, follow at Shelly Moo for my co-host and give her some high fives. And I guess that's about it. Let's close it on out. This Red Dragon looks really nice. I think it might... Oh, my God, it's eating my face! The dice to throw. I mean, usually we have a dice to, rocks fall, everybody dies. But, Dragon's eating face works just as well.
Yes, yeah.
Awesome. Thanks for sticking around for that. That was good.
Although that dragon is small enough, you could honestly eat its face.
I'm going to start feeding it after midnight and it'll just get more and more creepy looking. For those of you, I think I mentioned this before, but if you're just tuning in now, this is the Niv Mizzet Red Dragon, which is not a D&D dragon. It's a magic dragon, which looks a little different and is super fun from the Ravnica product.
Although, again, since we've mixed the chocolate and the peanut butter, He's now also a D&D dragon
That's
since you
true.
can meet him in D&D, and his stats are in the Guildmaster's Guide to Ravnica.
He is one of my favorite cards that I play with on Magic Arena as well.
Oh, very nice.
Because he lets you draw cards every time you cast a spell, which, oh man, it's so fun. Anyway, thank you again, everyone, for watching us on Twitch on this inaugural Dragon Talk of 2019. There is more to come. Thank you for watching on Fridays. We'll be doing this 12 to 3 p.m. or 3:11, as the case may be, going forward. And yeah, looking forward to this new time slot. And you are all awesome. Thank you for sticking around and chat as much as you have. And we'll be back next week with even more fun interviews and stuff. All right.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.